Light devoured everything, and then there was the crushing pressure, twisting, folding him inward like a scrap of cloth caught in a maelstrom. Aleric gasped, but no air filled his lungs. His body was gone, or maybe it had never existed at all. Threads brushed against his mind. Not physical threads, but currents of karma. The weight of lives lived, close to the surface. Hope, fear, regret, fleeting impressions, not memories, like echoes smudged across glass. For a moment he felt the ghost of 1,000 choices pressed against him. A missed step, a stolen kiss, a blade that had almost found its mark. But they were not his. They were the residue of others, bleeding into the void alongside him. Aleric felt it. The Citadel pulling his karma into something. Aleric's instincts screamed. Somewhere deep inside, a spark flared, a desperate, furious refusal. He seized the fraying edges of himself, clutching them tighter even as the weave strained to rip him apart. For a heartbeat, something inside the ritual shuddered. A ripple, a flaw, small but real. Far away or terribly close, he felt the weaver's attention sharpen as several of the runes engraved in the stone started to flicker. Ritual magic was almost infallible. The chance that something would go wrong was nearly non-existent. But it wasn't zero. All at once, Aleric felt his body tear at the karma of everyone in the room, as he tried desperately to disrupt the ritual. The currents screamed around him raw and unstable. The prisoners' meager reserves, the guards' hardened threads, the masked officiant's steady pulse of control. He could feel it all, brushing against him, snagging, snapping loose. It wasn't elegant, but it was working. The runes flickered again, and then pressure in the room rose to new heights. As he felt the karma pour into him, he hated himself for it. But right now, all that mattered was surviving. The iron ring at his wrists cracked with a brittle screech. The stone platform beneath him trembled, thin fractures spidering out across its surface. He seized the momentum, yanking the gathered karma inward, pain flashing white across his nerves. The masked figure stumbled, his control faltering completely. The guards shouted, moving in, but too late. Aleric ripped his wrists free with a raw, tearing sound, the broken manacles sparking as they snapped. The backlash hit the room like a hammer. Torches blew out in a rush of dead air. The floor heaved underfoot. Chains rattled, shrieked, and broke loose from the walls. Aleric barely kept his feet as the platform shuddered violently beneath him, and then the earth itself bucked. It was pure, blind misfortune. Luck twisted into disaster by the impossible strain of what he had done. The floor cracked open with a deafening roar, jagged fissures tearing through the stone like claws. Prisoners screamed. Guards staggered, their formations shattering. Chunks of masonry rained from the ceiling. One of the massive iron braziers tore free from its chains and crashed down in a thunderous spray of sparks and stone. The karma currents he had hijacked recoiled viciously, lashing out in chaotic bursts. Aleric moved without thinking, ducking low as a splintered beam crashed down, inches from where his head had been. He stumbled toward the edge of the platform, raw instincts taking over. A slab of the ceiling groaned overhead, fractures spidering outward as another tremor rolled through the Citadel's bones. The masked officiant disappeared under a collapsing archway in a spray of dust and broken stone. Aleric didn't look back. He ran. As he made his way through the corridors, the ground continued to lurch underfoot, sending cracks racing up the walls. Dust rained from the ceiling with every tremor, and the air was thick with smoke and the bitter stench of burning oil. Somewhere behind him, guards shouted orders, scattered and confused, but disasters didn't take orders. Aleric pushed himself harder, stumbling through the half-lit passages, his legs threatening to give out. He could feel the karma still seething under his skin, wild, unstable, burning him from the inside out. Not all of it was his. That thought gnawed at him even as he forced it down. Survive now. Regret later. He barreled around a corner and nearly collided with a pair of guards fighting to free themselves from a fallen archway. They barely registered him before he was past them, slipping through the wreckage like smoke. Another quake rippled through the floor. Stone cracked and an entire section of wall collapsed behind him, sealing off the path he had just taken. If they wanted to follow, they would have to dig it out first. Aleric stumbled onward, half blind in the swirling dust and torchlight, lungs burning. He did not know where he was going. He only knew one thing. He had to get out. Aleric stumbled, catching himself against a cracked pillar. For a second, he just leaned there, gasping for breath, feeling the weight pressing down on him from inside his own skin. He could still feel the foreign karma in him, even as he used it to avoid the falling debris. There was still so much. The ritual had been forcing it into him, pushing streams of power through him and into something else. Without that flood already driving through him, he knew he never would have been able to cause something like this to happen. The karma still leaking off him was pulling at the world in unpredictable ways, and while it was protecting him, it didn't extend the same courtesy to the people near him. Even if he did not mind taking out a few guards in his escape, he really didn't want to hurt the other people who had been dragged into this place just like him. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to move faster. A loose stone cracked behind him, followed by a distant shout. The guards were organizing finally, but the wreckage would slow them down. It had to. Aleric forced himself forward, ducking under a crumbling arch where the ceiling sagged low. The floor here was worse, slick with dust and shattered stone, each step threatening to send him sprawling. The tremors were slowing. He rounded a corner, searching blindly for any way out, and the floor gave way beneath him. The stones cracked like brittle glass, and before he could catch himself, he was falling. The feeling of suddenly falling was matched only by the confusion. He still had a decent amount of karma left from the ritual. Enough that something like this should not have happened. Aleric hit the lower corridor hard, and the air punched from his lungs. Pain flared sharp and immediate, and dust filled his mouth and nose. For a moment he just lay there, stunned, confusion swirling alongside the pain. He could still feel the karma burning under his skin, heavy, sharp, and unstable. It had not saved him from the fall. It barely answered him at all now. Only the rasp of dust in his lungs, the pounding of his heart, and the faint creak of broken stone settling overhead reminded him he was still alive. Slowly, Aleric pushed himself upright, every movement stiff with exhaustion. The lower corridor stretched out in front of him, narrow and half-choked with rubble. The walls were rougher here, old and unfinished, the stones sweating cold moisture into the stale air. He staggered forward, boots slipping on the uneven ground, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. The corridor tilted and warped in his vision, his body still reeling from the sudden fall. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, more deliberate than the random quakes of the collapse. Aleric froze, pressing himself into the wall. Breath held tight in his chest. They were footsteps, not the panicked running of the prisoners or the scattered footfalls of the guards. These were measured like a hunter. They were searching for runaways already. Aleric pushed off the wall, gritting his teeth against the pain, and moved deeper into the ruins. The walls here were rougher, veins of darker stone cutting through the mortar. Another tremor rattled overhead, loosening a sheet of dust that rained down over him like ash. He shielded his eyes, heart pounding. Ahead, the corridor split. To his left, a crumbling archway was half caved in, but narrow enough for him to square through. To his right was a broader hall, still lit by the few remaining torches. But he could hear faint voices echoing in the distance. He hesitated for only a second before ducking left, slipping through the broken stones, the jagged edges scraping at his skin. The narrow passage opened into a smaller chamber, a storage room, judging by the shattered crates and rusted chains scattered across the floor. Shelves sagged against the walls, holding nothing but dust and broken tools. He crouched low behind an overturned table, pressing his back against the wood, and listened. As the footsteps grew louder, Aleric flexed his fingers, feeling the unstable karma crackle along his nerves. He had never been good at traditional spellcraft, but now he might not have a choice if he wanted to fight his way out. The footsteps paused just outside the collapsed archway. Muffled voices exchanged sharp whispers, too low to catch the words. Then, silence. It prickled against his skin. Aleric barely dared to breathe. The seconds dragged on, and the tension coiled tighter and tighter until he thought he might snap under it. A scrape of metal against stone, boots shifting, then retreating. They were moving on. Aleric stayed hidden, counting heartbeats, waiting until the last echoes of their steps faded into the ruins. Only then did he exhale, shaky and shallow. He had to move. Now, before they circled back. He pushed himself upright, his body screaming in protest, and slipped out of the storage room through a cracked side door. The passage beyond sloped upward, a good sign. Maybe it would lead to the outer walls, or an abandoned tower. Maybe. He shoved the thought aside and focused on moving, on surviving the next 5 minutes, the next 5 heartbeats. One step at a time. The corridor twisted ahead, disappearing into the darkness. Aleric followed, boots scraping against the uneven floor, each step a fresh battle against the weight dragging at his limbs. His head pounded with every heartbeat. The stolen karma still burned inside him, raw and unstable, flickering against the edges of his control. The passage grew narrower as he moved forward, the walls closing in until he had to turn sideways to slip through. His shoulder brushed rough stone, flakes of old mortar crumbling at his touch. A dim light appeared ahead, wavering like a dying star. He moved toward it, cautious, heart hammering. The tunnel opened into a small antechamber, little more than a pocket carved into the rock. At its center, a broken pillar slumped sideways, half swallowed by the earth. At its base, scattered like discarded scraps, lay the remains of others who had tried to escape before him. Half buried in dust and rubble, the scraps of torn clothing still clung to them. Shackles rusted into the bone, fingers twisted in a final, desperate grasp at the stone. Aleric stopped just inside the threshold, nausea clawing at the back of his throat. He forced himself to look away, biting down the sick twist in his gut. He could not afford to mourn strangers. Not now. A sharp clatter echoed from somewhere behind him, distant but distinct. The search parties were coming back. Aleric slipped past the fallen pillar, hugging the wall, searching desperately for another exit. His fingers found a seam in the stone, barely wide enough to squeeze through. He didn't think. He pushed into the darkness, the stone scraping at his arms and legs as he forced his way forward. The passage narrowed to a crack, then widened again, spilling him into another corridor. This one sloped upward more steeply. Cold, damp air rushed against his face. He pushed onward, driven by instinct, by fear, by the thin thread of stubborn survival that refused to break. Behind him, the ruins of the Citadel groaned under their own weight. Another rumble shook the stones, a slow grinding sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. He had no idea how much time he had left before the rest of the fortress collapsed. He only knew he had to keep moving. Always moving. The corridor bent sharply, and ahead, through the mist and falling dust, Aleric caught a glimpse of something he had almost forgotten the sight of. Light. Not torchlight, real light. Cold and pale, filtering through a cracked breach in the outer wall. Hope surged, sharp and painful, inside his chest. He staggered forward, limbs numb and trembling, and reached the break in the stone. The gap was narrow, just wide enough for him to wedge through if he turned sideways. He braced himself and forced his battered body into the opening, scraping through the jagged rocks. The chill night air rushed against his face, clean and sharp and real. Aleric collapsed onto the damp earth beyond the wall, gasping for breath, the stars spinning dizzy above him through the mist and smoke. His wrists still bore the raw marks of the shackles. His body still ached with stolen power, tangled and burning inside him. But he was alive. He dragged himself upright, heart hammering. Behind him, the Citadel groaned again, louder this time, and a low, deep crack split the air like a falling mountain. He turned away from the ruins without looking back, and started to walk away.